And of course, they get hired by who hires them? The U.S. government hires them. So the U.S. government hires warlords, and not to pay them off, but actually to provide like convoy security. And we don't really know what their track record of human rights is in the field. We also, most will be interested to know that many people in the private military industry are not American. Even though that a company might have, it might be American-based, it might, all the C-suite, all the CEOs, they all might be American, but most of the rank and file are from all over the world. So what happens when their contract is up? A lot of them just go home, and some create their own private military companies. We also have subs. These are subcontractors. So if a company goes to Afghanistan to provide security and doesn't have enough, people to be security guards, they'll either create or find a local security company which they will train up. And when the question is what happens to them when the prime company goes home? Those subs stay there and they either go out of business or they look for other work. So we're starting to see a proliferation locally. There are stories of Ugandan private military companies operating in Somalia too, for example. And lastly is that I argue in the book that we are at a precipice. The industry is bifurcating right now between two different types of markets. A free market with mercenaries versus what I call a mediated market with military enterprisers. And that's sort of what we've seen in Iraq and Afghanistan, military enterprisers, not mercenaries. So let me explain what these are. So a mercenary company is a private military, it's a private army. It can wage war. It has, has force projection power, independent military campaigns. A classic example is Executive Outcomes in the 1990s. As a South African company that's now defunct. Had its own air force, miniature air force, with a Hind helicopter, which is a flying tank. These are true, when you think of private armies, that's what they are. Military enterprisers is a term that comes out of, for example, the 30 Years' War. These are companies that create or augment armies. They don't wage their own independent wars. This is companies that we've seen in Iraq and Afghanistan. So they can augment the U.S. Army, or they can help train up units, or other, they can train up the Iraqi army or the Liberian army, but they don't deploy them. They don't command that army, and they don't really want to. And these work in public-private partnerships with the client. And clients can use their market power to influence industry here. This is the UN could do this, the US could do this. If the UN decides to privatize some peacekeeping, which we can discuss in Q&A as well, it would have the opportunity to do that, which might be a better solution than regulation. But the thing is that if you have the competence to be this, you also can flip to that relatively easily. If you can create an army, you probably have the skill sets to deploy it as well. So I both put them in the category of PMC. Right now, we are going from a world where the U.S. used military enterprisers in Iraq and Afghanistan, but as the industry is searching for new markets, it could turn into this, into a free market rather than a mediated market. And the market is mediated by the monopoly of the clients. So that is of concern. The reason it's of concern is, let me step back, is that this is not a new phenomenon. Most of military history is private military history. Okay, mercenaries, second oldest profession, they're used by almost every power. The idea that only states should have the monopoly of force is a relatively recent concept, the last few hundred years. It's a Westphalian concept, more idealized than realized. In the high Middle Ages in Europe, for example, mercenaries were how you fought wars. Because remember, renting a car is cheaper than owning one. And back then, states didn't have any sort of privileged position in international relations. Anybody who could afford the means of war could wage it for whatever reason they wanted. Right? Any reason they wanted. And people did. You had city-states like Florence, you had kings like France, you had wealthy aristocratic families, you had trade unions, you had the Pope. Pope Innocent III had tons of mercenary armies. Mercenaries back then were not called mercenaries, they were called condottieri, which means contractor. They organized into private military companies, called free companies. And they were multinational as well. They had, in a company, could be as large as 10,000 people, like John Hawkwind. And they could have people from Scotland, from Syria, from Italy, from Bulgaria, and they'd all be working. And you'd show up and you'd sign a contract about what you're going to be paid and what would happen if you lost a limb. The contracts were all different. You'd also have maybe a booty clause, right? Like if you took over a city, how much shares you would get, etc. This began to go away as states monopolized violence over a slow process from the 16th to 18th century, the Westphalian worldview. The book concludes by saying, we are unraveling that, and that's normal, because private force is normal in this sweep of history. The idea that states should monopolize violence, states monopolize violence is actually the anomaly. And to say that states manage violence better is hard to make when you look at World War I and World War II, right? So, I don't necessarily say it's a good thing, but I say let's not treat it like the sky is falling, invest in more sky. I call this neo-medievalism. This is the idea of a non-state-centric, world. It's a multipolar world where the poles aren't just states, they're anybody, right? And that conflict is on the market. Now, I don't advocate for this. I'm just analyzing it. One of the chief challenges is the commodification of conflict, right? If you have a free market for force with mercenaries, then the idea of control, what happens to unsupervised or out-of-work mercenaries? They become bandits, they become predators, they become racketeers. They can take over states, and they did back in this era. You also have new actors. This empowers new actors. Can you imagine ExxonMobil with its own military, right? Or Bill Gates wants to take out that pesky, Larry Ellison once and for all. There's also a new type of warfare, contract warfare, where the logic of the marketplace comes into. Come on, walk over here. The logic of the marketplace comes into strategy. So just say you're AU and your rival's Georgetown, and you're going to take them over, and you're going to hire every mercenary outfit in Maryland and Virginia. Not just so you can overwhelm Georgetown with force, but to deny Georgetown a defense, because they have to go out and hire their own mercenaries, right? But Georgetown can then try to bribe your mercenaries to defect on game day, on battle day. And this happened a lot. It happened to Machiavelli a lot. He was basically, for a while, the Secretary of Defense for Florence, and Florence suffered repeated humiliations by poor mercenary management, which leads to some of his vitriol in the prince. Despite that, mercenaries were fairly widely used because of that. Now, I'm not saying this is a good thing. Okay, I'm being a little bit glib about it, but there are some serious concerns. First of all, if you have an industry invested in conflict, seeking conflict markets, you're going to have more war in the world. Does that make sense? Industry, if profit motive would dictate to elongate and expand conflicts, perhaps even create them. And we saw this in the High Middle Ages quite a bit. The second concern is that neo-medievalism, this type of world order, has the power to contain problems but not solve them. Okay? It doesn't mean the world's going to go into like Mad Max and a Thunderdome or Thomas Hobbes, but you'll have what I call, and others have called, durable disorder. Sort of what you see in parts of Africa today, for example, durable disorder. So it's overall, perhaps not pleasing, but it's not the end of the world. And the book is really, in some ways, ends up there. Like, this is what the increased privatization of force will mean for the 21st century. So with that, I turn it over to you, Rebecca, and then to the room.
Thank you. Thanks so much for that interesting presentation. glad we made it work with the visuals because those were very useful. So, I'll scooch over here so I don't block this. So I actually want to pick up here where you left off because since we're here at School of International Service, I think for those of you who haven't had a chance to read the book yet, you'll find what I think is a very bold hypothesis before the book is very interesting, namely drawing on Hedley Bull, this idea that the world order shifts from a Westphalian order with sovereign states being the central actors in the world stage to a neo-medieval order in which multiple actors and instances of governance coexist side by side, often overlapping. And I'm just curious if you could elaborate a little bit more on what role private military companies have in facilitating the shift in world order. Are they kind of just a phenomenon, a result of it, or are they actively contributing to it in some fashion or another?
They're both a symptom of this and they're an accelerant of it. So for those who are studying IR, I try to make this academic free, being that it's 3 p.m. But Hedley Bull was a classic English school IR theorist. And he, in the 1977 Anarchical Society, thought about what would alternative world orders be to the Westphalian order. And one of these was what he called new medievalism, which is sort of where this comes from. And it would have 5 attributes. One, and let me know if you think this is familiar. Now, he was writing this in 1977. One is states start to lose power around the world. 2 is that there's globalization of technology. It goes technical unification of the world, like globalization. 3 is that there's a rise of like international organizations. You know, states will start to pool their sovereignty. And the classic example is not just the UN, but like the EU and the AU and stuff like that. 3rd is the rise of non-state actors. And this by he means like multinational corporations, NGOs. And 5th, the last one, is private military warfare. Now, back in 1977, he looked at all this and says, not really, I don't see it enough in the world today to be a going concern. So he dismissed it in 77. But if you look at it now, 25 years after the Berlin Wall fell down, you have globalization, you have states losing strength all over the place, you have the rise of international organizations, you've had a proliferation of international organizations, you have multinationals. I mean, ExxonMobil is much more powerful than the Gabon, right? You can't just say that because it's a state, it's automatically more powerful. You have NGOs, similarly, as well. And now you have the last piece in this puzzle is this. Now, if you had gone back in 1989 and said, oh, someday America's going to be fighting wars with armed contractors, people think you're nuts, right? So I think it's both a symptom, but it's also it's a driver, it's an accelerant. It's also an independent variable, too.
And so following up on that, in your book, you take an analytical view in terms of what this neo-medievalism augurs for world order. Noting that the Westphalian order was an anomaly, and that medievalism is more so what one has seen, historically speaking, for many centuries. What do you think, if we're really landing into this new neo-medieval order, what do you think it means for, what does it portend, potentially, for democracy and the ability of people to control governments or instances of governance that may now be emerging to rival the state?
Well, they say that governments have been replaced by governance. And in some ways, you could argue, in some parts of the world, networks have replaced states. In terms of democracy promotion, I deliberately steer clear of democracy promotion in this book. Because democracy is something that's not shared. The love of democracy is not universally shared. And I think but there's certainly a lot of questions domestically about control of the armed forces when so much of the armed forces is contracted, and that Congress doesn't even have visibility on those contracts, even though they're writing the checks. So there's issues of transparency, there's issues of plausible deniability. I think in terms of our control of the armed forces, civilian control of the armed forces, contractors, certain types of contractors can be a bad thing, or need to at least have more rigorous transparency, more rigorous accountability measures. Right now, it seems that we have a paucity of that after decades still of using these things.
So no lessons learned from Iraq and Afghanistan?
There are so many lessons learned, it's never captured.
So I'm going to ask one more question. I'm sorry for stealing the floor for so long, but I had to just because there's so much thought-provoking information in this book that I just needed to follow up a bit. So I'm just curious, do you think that senior leadership in private military companies, do you think that they would agree with this perspective on what's happening? In terms of they certainly wouldn't call themselves military enterprisers, they wouldn't call themselves mercenaries. And I think that they would actually argue that they're contributing to propping up the Westphalian Order. When private military contractors work for big, strong governments like the US or the UK, they're doing so to further particular national interests. When they work for failing states, they're actually helping to potentially prop up those governments by doing things like training their military and police forces, by providing protection to critical national assets or leaders. Yeah. So they would, I think, counteract this and say, no, we're actually very much about reinforcing this Westphalian Order. How would you respond to that?
Well, I'd say that I get a talk from both left and right wings for this book, so I think I'm doing something right. I would say that's true. And the end of the book actually make a case for the industry. It's actually, the book is neutral, in some ways positive, and I suggest that the UN should consider using industry for peacekeeping operations under certain conditions. And I think that the industry does a lot of good. I think private military enterprisers particularly do a lot of good. Mercenaries is that's a different concern. And stability ops, etc. I think it's very good. The problem I have, though, is that they're generating, it's the unintended consequences. They're generating an industry worldwide. What happens to their subs when they go out of work, when the contract ends? What happens to people? Like they have, to say you have individuals from all over the world working for these companies. They go home. What do they do? So I think like they're not intending to do this, but they're also generating a worldwide industry. That's not their fault per se. Maybe it is, but they do a lot of good. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to turn over now to the floor. I'm just going to, I see hands popping up. I'm going to start over there with Ian, and then go over to you, and then you, and then you, and then you.
Thanks very much. I look forward to talking about your time in Liberia because I think we have some mutual friends.